Hi, and welcome to this presentation about a specific application of learning analytics. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how I use xAPI to manage in-time course adjustments that have a direct influence on the learning experience for the current class of students. My name is Katrina Ware. I'm an instructional designer at Penn State in the business school, and I initially gave this presentation as part of our Learning Design Summer Camp in the summer of 2017. So our learning objectives. First, what we're going to do is talk about the definition of xAPI and explain how it's used in learning analytics. Then hopefully we're going to explain how xAPI can be applied in ways that generate actionable data. And then we're not going to talk about this explicitly, but hopefully after watching this presentation, you'll be able to apply what you've learned by outlining your own xAPI or data collection strategy to meet the goals that align with what your unit or area of influence is trying to accomplish. So the formal definition of xAPI, it actually stands for the Experience API, and the X comes from experience, kind of like with user experience, being UX. xAPI is the Experience API. And one formal definition that I actually really like comes from a paper that has a lot of information that I respect the author's work. Is an e-learning specification that is designed to support the learning community in standardizing and collecting both formal and informal distributed learning activities. So the key terms to focus on here are standardized and distributed. As designers, we all know that there are tons of options out there for tools that we could possibly use to help faculty better achieve the goals they set out to teach. So learning is becoming distributed across all these different locations. We could have publisher materials, digital lab assignments, blogging assignments, and so on. And all of these different activities could be happening across different tool sets. So there's a ton of data that's getting generated, and it's being stored in all these different places. And of course, because it's being stored in all of these different places, it's kind of locked down within whatever tool that learning experience is living in. So you kind of have to go into the back end of like a publisher website to get any access to the data that students are generating if they're doing any tasks within publisher materials that go with their book. And that's only if the vendor has chosen to even allow the people who buy that product to access that data. So you are kind of stuck with, whatever the vendor has left you, and that could be nothing in some cases. So there's no way really to aggregate all of the data without some real manual work to pull it all together if in the cases where you do have access to it. So when you have sections in your course of maybe 25 students or less, it's a task to complete all of that data collection and aggregation and putting it all in one place by yourself, but it's not impossible. However, when you start to scale up, or if you're teaching multiple courses that each have 25 students in them, it starts to become a really time-consuming and in some cases just unmanageable task to complete. So what xAPI does is it provides a common language for those various vendor tools. It's about connecting everything. So this image kind of gives you an idea of all the different types of activities that xAPI is able to communicate. And it's an active specification, so the community is constantly working on it, and they meet weekly to go over it. Notice in this image that there are some tools and activities in this bubble that are happening in physical spaces, like listening, approving, and building. Those are all things that might not be taking place in a digital space. So we'll get to that later, but just keep that in the back of your mind that xAPI, and in combination with a couple of other technological advances that we have, does make it possible to collect data about physical experiences that students are having that are taking place outside the digital landscape. So this image is another way of thinking about how xAPI is able to connect things from a technical perspective. So NGDLE stands for Next Generation Distributed Learning Environment, and it's gaining ground in some spaces as folks continue to bump into walls with traditional LMSs and trying to utilize new tools. I know at my institution we run into this issue a lot where there's something new that we would like to use and integrate into our LMS. However, it takes some time for it to be approved by whatever committee, or even for the people who run our LMS, the vendor, to make the updates that we need in order to get it to work properly. And other institutions I know are facing this problem as well. So it's not an isolated issue, and it's something that as instructors become more technically savvy and students become more demanding of experiences that are tailored to their learning, that we're just going to continue to run into more and more of these issues of not getting everything to connect inside one tidy little LMS. So by utilizing a good data strategy and choosing tools that are good and open and whose creators have made their APIs and the data publicly available, the influx of information that can come from a distributed, connected learning environment is really able to give a really nice overview of what students can do and what they are doing and how they're accomplishing all these different tasks across all these different tools and activities. So that's a really high level kind of exploration of learning analytics and what xAPI is. So to get down to a kind of nitty-gritty level of detail, you can add this to the definition of xAPI. So essentially, when you're implementing an xAPI strategy, you're collecting data that at its most simple state is telling us these three things, as well as giving us a timestamp. So you're getting the actor, who's the user, and you're getting a verb, so what they did, and the object. So for this, it's the what. It could be the video that they watched, in which case it would be a link to the, if it's a YouTube video, it would be the link, or if it was a file upload, it would be the file name that would come through in the statement. So it's kind of like a sentence. And then, of course, as we know, everything that we do in digital is time-stamped, so you also get the time that that action occurred. And this can be as detailed or as vague as you want it to be. Again, I'm not going to get into super heavy detail here, but the xAPI specification is always growing. There are lots of verbs, there's lots of different use cases, and I would definitely encourage you to check out what all the possibilities are when you have a chance to absorb that information. So that's not to say that the spec isn't flexible. You're able to do a lot of different things with it beyond these three, plus the timestamp. So you're able to add a hypothesis, you can add descriptors to make things easier to sort on the back end when you're looking in your LRS for the data. It really just depends. And again, checking out the major sites and groups that are working on the spec is where you're going to get the best information that'll help you make better decisions as far as what exactly you're looking for to accomplish in your own xAPI or data collection strategy. So some use cases that we've already implemented and that I've already seen are, pretty much, they're kind of basic, but for the folks who've been benefiting from them, they're very, very happy with the results. So, for example, in a flipped classroom, it's easy to use xAPI and a data collection strategy to see who's prepared for class. So this is actually an example that comes from a class that I teach. And in my course, I meet with my students once a week for 50 minutes. So it's really the perfect setup for a blended model. And so I have my students come to class prepared beforehand. And one particular activity that I do with my students is a resume workshop. And this is one that is really essential that they prepare for, because I could have my students, they're freshmen, so first year students. Some of them come from high school having never written a resume. Some of them come from their high schools having already written and had graded by an instructor maybe 3 resumes. Or maybe they've done some summer classes at their local community college where they had to do a resume. So they're all at different levels. And when we want to do a resume workshop to kind of bring them up to what our particular college's standard resume writing level is, it's important to even the playing field for all of our students to make sure that they at least have some basics down before they start looking at each other's work, so that they are able to make the best value out of our workshop time. So I put in a bunch of resources online about writing achievement statements, how to look at experiences that students commonly have in high school, like clubs and activities, and how to draw out transferable skills from those activities to put on a resume, and basic formatting and things like that. The stuff that's kind of simple to absorb on your own, or at least something that's good to prep for in order to get them in a better headspace for our class. So I have all these resources online, and of course with my xAPI strategy, I'm tracking what the students are clicking on, how often they're accessing the resources, and whether they're watching the videos that go with these resources in order to make sure that they're prepared. And so last semester when I was teaching this course, or this class, I was able to check, we meet on Wednesday mornings. So I checked on Tuesday night just to see, I had this sinking feeling that maybe some of them wouldn't come prepared because they are first year students. And I was able to see that I had a handful of students, maybe 6 or 7 out of my class of 25, who did not even log in yet to our course to check the materials out. And so by being able to pull that report, I was able to come to work early the next day, print off some hard copies of the materials, which I wasn't originally planning on doing. But I printed off 10 copies of each thing, and then I had those available so that when my class started at 9 o'clock, I could tell the students, okay, let's get into our groups and let's just start. And you have the group of students who did know what they were doing. They knew where their pairs were. They were able to get in their groups right away and make the most use of the 50 minutes that we have together. And then I had my handful of 6 or 7 off in the back who were just looking completely lost. And I was able to go up to them and say, so you guys are the ones who didn't check, the class materials beforehand. So I have my handouts. Work together, work through the handouts, and then use whatever time is left to workshop your resumes. And this way I was able to have the students who did take the time to prepare jump right into the activity and not waste their time going over material that they already knew because they did come to class prepared. So that's a good flipped classroom example of how you can adjust on the fly for your class of students to provide them a better experience. Some other instances where I've seen xAPI or any kind of data collection used are to see if there's a early preference of a class between articles and videos to do supplemental content. So I'll have an instructor who provides a selection of articles and videos about specific topics as they're working through early modules in the course. And then he'll go in and he'll check later on and say, okay, it looks like this class of students, for whatever reason, they're downloading the articles more than they are watching the videos. So maybe for my future modules that I'm going to teach in the future concepts, I'm going to spend more time looking for better articles because it seems like that's what the students are getting their information from. Whereas, maybe I'm not going to put up as many videos, or maybe I'm not going to, use most of my time on video because it seems like the students are getting more from articles. And then the pulse check for an online course is another common one that you may have heard, but that our instructors really like. And so for this, they seem to talk about the lack of recognition that they're able to get from that face-to-face course. When you're looking at an audience and you're able to see that they are with you or that they're nodding along, they're engaged, they're obviously, kind of keeping up with what you're putting down. But in the online course, you're not really getting that because you're not always synchronously there with your students. So our faculty have started to use these pulse check quizzing tools to just get a sense, and they're just really brief review questions that ask, do you feel like you've achieved the learning objective for this class or for this lesson? Did this video help you accomplish the learning goals that were set out for this lesson? And then based on the data that they're able to collect from those questions, they know whether or not they can move on or if they need to go back and add some more supplemental resources. So another way that I'm proposing to start utilizing xAPI is with course evaluations. So here is an overview, kind of our traditional ADDIE model of design. So you have your linear, analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate. Then we kind of moved over to this cyclical ADDIE where the evaluation leads into new analysis, and it's just this rotating cycle constantly that goes along. But this is still kind of rigid, even with the cyclical version. Traditionally, the evaluative pieces come after a course concludes, and when we go back and redesign based on feedback from the learners, we've kind of lost that initial group that provided us with that feedback in the first place. So the model, again, here's our traditional linear model and that evaluative piece at the end, but the model that I've kind of started to use when I look at this is breaking out that evaluative piece and making it a little bit more expansive. So over here on the right, we've got the steps for evaluation that we're going through, and the way that I kind of try to do my evaluation is that as I'm collecting feedback and making decisions based on that feedback, I'm implementing the change, so it's represented by these purple arrows that affect later activities in the course. So it's kind of like this little uphill towards hopefully better personalization effect that we've got going on here. So I find that giving students more opportunities to provide the feedback influences the way that the course is shaped later on, and that they know this, and it provides them with more incentive to actually give better feedback. Limiting the evaluation to mid-semester or end of semester doesn't give the students a lot of incentive to provide really critical feedback, because they're not going to be affected by those changes that result from that feedback. Or if they do, it might be too late in the course, that halfway through, you don't really have a whole lot of time to make major changes to the second half of a class. So by giving a lot of quick, small opportunities early on, it kind of lets you add those changes in as you go, and then continue to reevaluate and see if those new decisions hold true throughout the course. It's also, the traditional model of waiting till halfway or until the end doesn't make the best conditions for an accurate collection of feedback, because of time passing since students have participated in an activity or completed a specific module. You have other factors in the course influencing opinions. So maybe the first time that they've performed a group activity, it went really well, but then the second time, maybe it wasn't so great for completely different reasons. But if you wait until halfway through, that second time that was the bad experience is the one that's sticking in their mind. And then instead of getting, all the group work was bad, is what you hear from them, instead of, the first group assignment was great, but the second one did not go so well, and here's why, and here's the difference between what happened in the first and the second, because you don't have that data that you collected from the first if you're not asking for it right away. So what I found, just to kind of summarize, providing more opportunities for feedback not only gives students better incentive to provide it, but it also gives you better feedback when they do provide it, because it's more recent, the experiences are fresh in their mind, and they aren't having their opinions influenced by other factors in the class. So at this point, I'm going to take a pause and do a demonstration. So here's that example that I mentioned earlier about the resume workshop that I do with my students, and I'm just going to kind of walk you through so that you can see kind of what I've been doing in practice. So again, I've got my learning objectives here. I always like to do that so students know exactly what the goals are of the activity that they're completing. And then, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of resources here for transferable skills. They're all directly linked so that those links are trackable. And then after each resource, what I like to do is try to put in kind of like a rating opportunity for the students. So here they get to tell me on a scale of 1 to 5, rating the usefulness of the transferable skills resource from Princeton University that I've collected here. And so ideally the students would rate this after they've reviewed the article or the resource that I've posted, and then tell me if they thought, based on the learning objectives, whether or not it helped them achieve the skill that they were set out to accomplish by using that resource. So by this token, I'm able to look at that data on the back end and say, okay, a lot of the students seem to get it. I'm going to keep using this resource. Maybe I'm going to keep using other resources from Princeton University because they sound like they're doing a good job and they've explained it in a way that makes sense to my students. On the other hand, if this resource wasn't performing well or it was getting low ratings, maybe I would look for not only something different to provide for them for this skill, that would help them achieve these skills that they needed, but also I would try to find another resource bank in general. So maybe not Princeton, maybe I would go to a different university for this particular resume writing resource that they have. So that's one example in practice. And again, we've got more links here where I would go in and add those questions. And then I like to do some of these overall questions and assessments, kind of like I mentioned as well. So here's one, this is, describing what the activity was. So this would be like a culminating kind of assessment that I would have them do at the end of class. So this activity, the resume workshop, helped me achieve the learning objectives of the lesson, which again I had posted at the top of the page, so they were all aware of them. And then I have them rate whether they agree or disagree with the statement and how strongly. And so then that's one of the questions. Another question, allows them to provide some open feedback so that I can collect that as well. And these questions are in here with H5P, which is a really cool little build your own interactive tools that you don't have to know any JavaScript or anything like that. You just kind of use a drag and drop editor and complete your questions, and then you can copy and paste HTML and embed them into pages. So that's how this has been done. And what I like about this is that it's really flexible, and I can ask any kind of question that I want. I can style it, however I want. So that's what I'm using here. But again, so that first question was about rating how much they agreed with whether the activity helped them meet the lesson objectives. And then I have them, giving them the opportunity to provide some additional feedback if they want to. And then here again, the ultimate culminating assignment here. This resume workshop is the last thing that we do as far as our career readiness unit that we've done. So again, I could be more specific with this question, absolutely, but when I see my students in class, I explain this a little bit better. So after completing the work associated for this topic, I feel that I have achieved the learning objectives stated for this lesson. And again, it's asking them to agree or disagree. And this is another question that I'm really interested in and something that I'm working on kind of on the side here. But I'm asking the students to rate their level of engagement with activities presented on this page. And then what I am hoping to do with this particular question and this series of questions that I have throughout my class is to go back and look at how engagement aligns with data and see if there are any, correlations between the number of times the students have logged in, the amount of things that they've clicked on, how many times do they revisit, how much time in general do they spend on the page, and then also in conjunction with their grades or their scores. And to see if the students who've rated their engagement as being high has any association with any of that data that I'm collecting and in conjunction with their score, or if low ratings are not really indicative of anything. Again, just kind of like a side little research thing that I'm doing, but another way to kind of utilize an xAPI strategy. And again, the in time kind of immediacy of this is still fresh in their minds, so they can think about, okay, I just completed this. This is a really good opportunity to reflect. It kind of lets them sit with what they've just done. And it also asking them about their engagement kind of gives them that opportunity to check in with themselves and say, was I engaged with this material, or did I just kind of blow through this to get it done? So a couple of different things going on there. I don't really have too much of a pointed direction with this, but I'm really interested to see what I get. So with that, we'll go back to the presentation. That's kind of what it looks like, currently in practice, but I want to take a moment to talk about some future directions. So the key here is that really anything can trigger an xAPI statement to be generated. One of the instructors that I work with in a different discipline is currently collecting xAPI statements from his physical classroom, and he's using beacons in the room that are set to only broadcast to a very specific small location. And he uses them to collect attendance data from his classes. Basically, he broadcasts the check-in link using the beacon, and students are able to use their computer or their phone to access that link and click on it to record their attendance for the day. Another really nice example that we have here at Penn State is the Arboretum here that we've got going on. There is a tool, an app that kids can use to help them learn, and it's something that they call talking trees. And so what you do when you go to our Arboretum is it's kind of like a self-guided tour, but your tour guide is the app. So you download the app, you fire it up when you're in the Arboretum, and as you're walking through, your phone's being pinged by every beacon that you're walking past. And again, they're set up to only broadcast to a specific range, and that range can be very small or very wide. So as you're walking through with your iPad or your phone, if you've downloaded this app that's searching for these beacons broadcasting, you can learn more about whatever tree or sculpture or garden that you're sitting next to or standing by. And you can read things about what kind of tree it is, or if it's a flower, what is it, a seasonal, does it come back every year, what kind of bugs does it attract birds, that kind of thing. So It's really a way to provide a better physical learning experience that can still happen asynchronously, and just kind of provide a more customized experience for students to go at their own pace and at their own time that works for them. And so this practice, while it might seem very niche right now, for museums and other kind of, exhibit style learning experiences that we're familiar with, this is really just kind of the start of what we could be doing in the physical space now that we have the technology of, tools like beacons and data collection strategies and things like that. So it really opens up the possibilities as far as designing for collecting data. And so when you're kind of coupling that with the idea that you could be taking information from student information systems like swipe card access at different campus facilities, for example, a library or a dining hall, or leaving the dorms and coming or going to the gym, you could really start to build this huge portfolio of data that could tell a very compelling story about students who succeed versus students who don't have as much success, or who matriculate in 4 years versus 5 or more than 5. So again, I bring this up just to kind of put this in the back of your mind that while we do have the ability to collect a lot of data, I think it's really important that we are ethical in the ways that we collect data, and that students are aware of the data that's being collected about them and what it's being used for. I really think that transparency is essential to having not only that trusting relationship with your student and the faculty, but also in order for both parties to benefit the most. As long as if students don't really have a stake in the game other than better personalizing their own experience, they're going to be less likely to try to game the system by doing multiple logins or clicking all the links because they think that more clicks is going to get them a better grade. So, it's important that students are aware of what's being collected and how it's being used, and that they realize that it's not being used to judge them in any way other than to collect their feedback about, their own learning experience, and use to then tailor it to hopefully make it better for them. And there's other conversations happening in this space right now as well about whether students should have access to their own data and how to view it and how to present that to them in a context that doesn't harm them. You thinking about a classic example maybe of folks who get, a smart watch that tracks their physical activity. Again, it's similar with learning. Everyone's different. Everyone learns differently, just like everyone's body is different and functions differently. I know some of the ones that do sleep tracking, if somebody could look at that and say, oh my gosh, I only get 5 hours of sleep a night, and this is telling me that, that makes me less likely to live a long life, or something. But again, because everybody's body is different, maybe that individual can function perfectly fine on that 5 hours of sleep every night as opposed to the traditional 8. And so, obviously, as they say with all of those fitness watches, you always want to consult a doctor if you ever have any questions about anything related to your health. So we're trying to figure out ways in the community to kind of facilitate that same kind of guided data experience with students. So there's been talk of, saying, you're looking at your data here in your classes, but it's really important if you think you're struggling or if you have questions about what this data says, maybe work with your advisor or talk to a teacher or talk to an expert who can help you kind of make better sense of that, because every individual is different and everybody does things differently online and learns differently. And, just because there are numbers, it doesn't necessarily reflect the whole picture. So something to think about as far as data ethics and privacy and making sure that we're actually doing good and not harming the students that we're trying to help. So another note, if you are interested in learning more about xAPI or getting a more technical rundown of what the spec is and finding more resources about that, I've created with some of my colleagues an open educational resource. This is a course that is about like I said, more technical overview of xAPI. What do you actually need in order to implement an xAPI data collection strategy and things like that. So if that's something that interests you, you can follow these links. There's 2 methods to get there. You can go to elmsln.org, and it's one of the links right at the top of the page. in the body. It's hyperlinked as Open ULMS What is xAPI, or you can follow this short link at the bottom and that will also take you there. So I hope you enjoy that. That is what I leave you with, and hopefully this presentation has helped you learn a little bit more, think a little bit differently about data collection and the ways that you can use data to inform course decisions. Thank you.